welcome everyone for this week's lunchtime learnings from ICT Skillnet. And first of all, I'd like to thank ICT Skillnet for inviting me along to speak today. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Clare Dillon. And I, up until about 2 years ago, I worked with Microsoft Ireland on their leadership team, and I headed up the Developer Experience and Evangelism Group. And during that time, I was involved in a lot of innovation projects or pilot projects with Microsoft's customers and partners using the latest Microsoft technologies. And about 2 years ago, I left Microsoft and I started up my own consultancy. And I've been lucky enough to have had the opportunity to work with large numbers of organizations to learn a little bit about how they're implementing their innovation projects and how they go about it. And so I'm delighted to be here today to maybe share some of my learnings over that time, because I have become, I think, very, very interested in understanding what types of behavior and competencies make for good innovation within organizations. And when I first actually gave the first version of this presentation, it was before Christmas. And I think it's really interesting that at the time, I was making the case that everything is changing and that the world is becoming a different place. And usually when I give those presentations, I would start off with the idea of the fourth industrial revolution, which many of you may have heard of. From our perspective in the tech industry, it's a term that's been bandied about quite often. And I suppose it's really to indicate the fact that there has been so much innovation happening in the last number of years. The scale and the scope and the pace of innovation that's been happening has really been unprecedented in our history. And one of the most interesting things about what's been happening in the last decade, say, has been that it hasn't just been one area that has been innovating. The innovation has been happening across a broad range of fields, not just in the digital or tech sphere with things like Internet of Things or blockchain or artificial intelligence, but also in the biological world in terms of our ability to decode our genomes, and the physical world in terms of things like autonomous vehicles and robotics or 3D printing or the invention of brand new materials. And when you start looking at the interweaving of all this innovation, you begin to see that the possibilities for our next century moving forward are huge. And it really does represent a shift change in terms of how this innovation will impact how we live and work. And of course, that's not all that's changing. The context is changing. For the first time, we've got 5 generations working simultaneously in the workforce. We've got new business models emerging that are changing how we do business, that are putting under threat some business models that have been in place for generations, for centuries or more. And our nature of competition is also changing, where competition is coming from, what it looks like, the fact that startups can now challenge huge brands. These are all things that are relatively new in the last number of years. And the landscape is changing. So there is so much that's happening in terms of climate change, how we are all going to respond to that. Politics. When I first gave this presentation, we were bang smack in the middle of Brexit. Of course, I guess we're still bang smack in the middle of Brexit. And then, of course, crime, because every time there is an innovation, it's like there's a reaction from the criminal world in order to be able to exploit these new circumstances. But I don't think anything could have prepared me, at any rate, for the circumstances that have come into play with COVID-19. And for me, the kind of situation we now find ourselves in puts all of this and what I'm going to share with you now at an even higher priority for organizations. So everything has changed. It's changed in the last number of years. It's definitely changed in the last number of weeks, for most of us at any rate. And I think one thing, of course, that hasn't changed is, because some things never do, is that if you do nothing when the world around you is changing, then effectively you're moving backwards. I love this quote from Lauren Bacall. She may have said this decades ago, but if the truth in this hasn't changed, and the truth is that if while the world is changing, people do nothing, they are in fact moving backwards. So thinking about that, usually when faced with those kinds of threats or uncertainty, people are all about, let's innovate. How can we get more innovation into our organization? And I think that's really interesting, because sometimes that can actually result in what maybe some people might call the idea of innovation theater. So I've definitely seen some circumstances where people have some innovation checkbox type of activities. The board says, what are we doing to innovate? And they say, oh, we've invested X amount of dollars in our innovation practice. But do the actual innovation projects actually go anywhere? One of the terms I have used before is this idea of pilot purgatory. I certainly have suffered from that, where you build something, you think it is the most marvelous technical innovation you have ever seen in your entire life. And why wouldn't everyone love it? And yet it never gets implemented. No one takes it on board. We never get to see the real potential of that innovation. And sometimes that's just because organizations are too fixed and they're not able to adapt or accept or adopt new technologies as it comes out. So I think this idea of how and what organizations need to become in order to be able to get the benefits of innovation is a really interesting one. I also like this idea of, we need to innovate. I know what we'll do. We'll paint everything primary colors and buy some bean bags. And that way we'll just be generally more innovative. And of course, that's not what really happens either. So for me, I've been looking at some of what I like to call the idea of innovation tradecraft. Like, what are the competencies and the skills that we need to be better at innovation? The first one that I came across suppose a half a year ago, when I started contemplating why is it that certain decision-making processes seem completely broken? Like, why are decisions made that are made? What criteria are being used? When they are being made, how come some of them are never followed through on, right? And I remember complaining about this particular scenario to some colleagues. And I started looking into this idea of how can we all get better at decision-making? And I think it's really interesting. Daniel Kahneman, who's the Nobel-winning behavioral economist who also wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, if you listen to any of his talks on the topic, you'll become quite despondent, really, because he's very clear about the fact that we are dreadful at making decisions. We are completely blind to our blindness. As human beings, we are designed to, we do not know how little we know when we make decisions, and we are really at the mercy of, in many respects, our hormones. So you think about the idea of a decision-making ideal. You kind of encounter a choice, you analyze your options, you choose a path, you maybe revisit if it doesn't work out. That's what you'd like to think you do, but that's not often the case. What's more likely the case is that you encounter a choice, you pick the first or most convenient option, or whatever was the most recent thing suggested to you. You get totally emotionally attached to that option, and no one can tell you anything different. You choose that option, and generally speaking, very little review formally happens afterwards. And if anything does, you kind of retrospectively justify why everything happened. I don't know if you're familiar with that scenario. It certainly sounded very familiar to me when I first saw it. And partially that's down to the fact that we are all biased, right? I mean, there are 188 cognitive biases that have been identified. And so the notion that any of us are able to make completely rational, fact-based decisions is kind of, if you think that, it's kind of a delusion, because we are slaves to our biases and our emotions and the hormones that affect us in everyday life. And it's not to say that all biases are bad. In many respects, biases help us survive. They help us survive in a world where there is too much information. If we went through a critical analysis of every decision we had to make in the day, we would never get out of bed. So I think what's important to recognize is that biases exist. So many of them exist. They exist around what we remember, how we process information, how we give meaning to things where we shouldn't give meaning to things, why we need to act fast in certain circumstances when we make these snap decisions. These biases affect all these things, and it's kind of naive to think that we can exclude them from our decision making. So in that case, what do? Well, it turns out there's an entire discipline around decision-making architectures, which I wasn't aware of. And I love it when you start looking into something and you suddenly dig a little deeper and realize there's a whole profession and body of knowledge around these themes. So this was one I learned about. There are a whole slew of decision-making architects out there helping organizations how they figure out how to make decisions. And I'm just going to give, again, an overview of many of these topics because we only have a half an hour, but I hope some of them will spur some interest in following through on learning a little bit more. This diagram is from a white paper by David Ullman, and it kind of looks at a decision architecture that could happen within organizations. Now, there is a lot of theory around when you might need to deploy a decision architecture, maybe not for every decisions, but certainly for very important strategic decisions within an organization, like, for example, what you're going to innovate on or spend money on. Typically, you should be deploying some sort of decision architecture and understanding how decisions are made, why they're made, how you review them, who's involved, et cetera, et cetera. This particular white paper goes into detail into 10 areas of suggestions around that. I'm not going to cover all of those, but I am going to cover the 5 that I thought was most interesting. The first is an organization has to take it seriously. They can't be making snap decisions. And there's often a case of this idea of leaders and organizations having a favorite solution and then retrospectively justifying why people pick that solution. But the organization has to take this idea of how you make decisions seriously for decision-making architecture to work. It's important to include all relevant stakeholders. And David Ullman kind of talks a lot about this, that there are 4 main groups that need to be involved in a decision. First of all, the people making decision, fair enough. The people who have information to give to that decision. The people who are going to carry out the implementation of that decision. But most importantly, the people who will be affected by the decision. And all those 4 categories of people need to be involved in various different parts of the process in order for that decision to be the best possible decision and for it to be actually have impact afterwards. It's always good practice to make sure there are multiple alternatives, and it's important to record the decisions that are made with the rationale behind why they were made and communicate that, because that really helps with this last bit, which is buy-in. And it turns out that the idea that you can make decisions and not necessarily work on buy-in is, again, probably less optimal. So really, organizations, if they want decisions to be really effective, they have to spend as much time thinking about the buy-in and the implementation as they do about what the decision is in the first place. And that's often left out. It's kind of like, well, we've made the decision now, and then they wonder magically why something hasn't changed in 6 months. The point is, if there's no effort put into understanding and planning that and thinking about buy-in, people will revert back to their whatever the previous case was, because we're all subject to this idea of staying and doing, not changing and doing what we've always done. But this brings us, this rise in this practice of decision making and better decision making brings us this idea of consensus building, which I think again is very interesting. Because it turns out that right now we are seeing a complete rise in the number of stakeholders involved in any decision in organizations. And this becomes particularly important when you're trying to influence a decision-making process, either within your organization or if you're trying to sell, for example, software and services into other people's organizations. And these trends of having more people involved has been happening pretty much since the financial crash. And the idea is, well, there's been a growing aversion to risk. No one wants to be the person who makes the failing decision. There's often large numbers of people now involved in decisions and have to be involved in decisions because they are so much more complicated, or complex. They require sometimes IT, ops, procurement, if it's a tech component included. You may need to get input from legal and compliance if there are regulatory requirements. You may need to have specialist regulatory advice, for example, if you're working in healthcare or anywhere where there are regulations. There are often regional players who have particular needs. They have to input into decisions. There's a lot more customer functions that are now, when we think about the customer journey and customer experience end to end, lots more people have to be involved in some of these decisions around how to innovate. And of course, this trend towards flatter organizations and prioritizing cross-silo kind of collaboration means that by far the number of people who might be involved in a buying decision, for example, can be huge. I remember in the past we used to describe this idea of having a technical decision maker and a business decision maker and having to influence both of them. These days there are far more. And of course, the problem is that the more people you have involved in a buying decision or any kind of decision, the less likely they will actually come to consensus. So this data was covered in the Harvard Business Review, but it's from Challenger Customer. And it would talk about the fact that the likelihood for a team to make a purchase decision dramatically decreases after 5 people or more are involved in the decision. goes down to 31% likelihood of them making a high quality purchase decision. And these days, the average number of people involved in a stakeholder decision, or involved in a serious decision, is 6.8. So what you're seeing is, just by the fact that this decision-making processes are becoming flatter and involve more people, it is far harder to actually get people to come to a decision. And they are more likely to default to, we'll just wait and see and do nothing because that's probably safer. And so that brings us to this idea that it's not just important to figure out and understand how decisions are made, but it's important to be able to build consensus with people. So if you've got, for example, 3 stakeholders, typically, when we'd be thinking about influencing decisions, you'd say, right, let's identify our stakeholders, let's find out what they need, let's build personalized value propositions and get them to them. But the problem with that strategy is that sometimes if you actually find out all of these individual priorities and then feed them with a value proposition that amplifies their personal priorities, what you can be doing is sometimes pulling these stakeholders further apart in their organizations. They now care more about what they care about than getting to a decision. So with consensus building, you might want to look at the idea of actually figuring out what are the commonalities between the stakeholders and understanding how you can actually drive a consensus or a joint learning opportunity between stakeholders in which you'd be more likely to be able to get to a decision that actually is one that you would like them to get to. So the challenger customer talks about the fact that the biggest challenge isn't improving an ability to sell or influence, it's addressing the customer's inability to agree. And so you really want to be creating these collective learnings that kind of focus on perhaps what might be a small subsection of people's priorities, but there are the common ones across many stakeholders. So it's a whole interesting topic to look at when you're thinking about influencing decisions. And next comes, I suppose, one of my favorite topics of the last 6 months or so. I was introduced to this idea of the Cynefin Decision-Making framework. And anyone who knows me knows I've become slightly obsessed with this. Now, this is being recorded, so I hope I do it justice because it's quite a complicated or complex topic in itself. But Dave Snowden's Cynefin Decision-Making framework is all about complex adaptive systems. And more importantly, what he calls anthro-complexity, which is the idea of how, when people are involved, things can become a lot more complex. And what he does is he divides kind of decisions into various different domains, 5 different domains, in fact. And they are typically listed as either ordered, which would be the clear and complicated domains, or unordered or unpredictable, which would be the complex and chaotic domains. And there's one there in the middle that it says AC, and that kind of stands for confused, when you don't know what domain you're in. And the whole idea behind Cynefin is the idea that for a long time, we have been operating in an ordered world where we kind of know the answers and the best practices of business to actually address the situation we're in. So if you're in the bottom right-hand corner there, and you're thinking about, you have a problem where it's pretty clear what the answer is. You know what the best practice is. You can just get on and do it, right? That's where process-oriented people shine, because they know what to do and they just get on with it and do it. You move up then into the complicated space. There's lots of things that are complicated. Putting a man on the moon is a complicated problem, but we pretty much know how to do it. We know the steps. So we can go through those steps, and there may be a few options for us. There may be good practices we can choose from. But we kind of know the relationship between cause and effect, and we know that if we put this much investment in, we will get this result. The problem is when we think it's complicated, but it actually is complex. And when you're in the complex domain, things aren't ordered. We don't know what the relationships are between cause and effect. Sometimes there are actors playing in these scenarios where we can't even see them. There are dark relationships which we actually can't identify. So we don't know what will work. And in a lot of cases, in today's world, I certainly find that there are a lot of scenarios that fit this description. In my work in Microsoft, I definitely know there were a good number of scenarios where we were entering into new markets with new technology, looking at new audiences, and any of our playbooks, and we had lots of playbooks, had to be thrown out the window because we didn't know what the answer was. And so you have to get better at experimentation, and more particularly safe to fail experiments. So this is the idea that as people in organizations, we need to get better at understanding how to fail without feeling bad about it. Kind of understanding about how do we actually create lots of experiments and figure out how to move forward through that experimentation. So this is a topic which I think deserves a lot more time than I can give it here, but I would totally recommend people take a look at it because I find it incredibly interesting. Some of the very brief learnings or ideas that come from it might be, figuring out, are you in a complex domain? Figuring out how to do that. Then thinking about what experiments you can run. What is your portfolio of experiments that you can run simultaneously to see how to move forward, to kind of sense the scenario and then adapt as you move forward. How can you monitor the impact? And then how can you both amplify success and dampen failure? So plan that before you start the experiment. And so really what you've got is, instead of a project plan where everyone's going in one direction and thinks they can do activities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and will get an assumed result, you have people working on various different experiments and understanding that not all of them will be successful, but that over time you will be getting closer to truths where you can actually figure out what's going on and innovate in an appropriate way. Dave Snowden actually is running a number of projects at the moment around COVID-19 and the emergency pandemic situation with leaders and working with the UN and folks like that. So if you are interested in his work, definitely recommend checking out thecognitiveedge.com to see what he's doing at the moment. And another related topic is this idea of anti-fragility, which again, I came across in relation to thinking about complex adaptive systems. And this idea and the term was coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which some of you may know from The Black Swan. He wrote that book, which was talking about really unexpected occurrences and how they can upset markets and things like that. And I really like this idea because it's the idea that he was looking at what is the opposite of fragile. So we all know what fragile is, right? Like if you've got glassware in a box and you decide to shake up the box a bit, it's likely to break. It's fragile. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment about, in the context of enormous change and stressors, that we need to either be perhaps robust or resilient. And if you think about what that means, typically robust means that, you are not going to be shook by the change. Like, nothing's going to change your purpose, your direction, how you're operating. And people might be robust. And that may not often be the best approach to a rapidly changing environment because you may be now going in the wrong direction. And you might be resilient, which means that you are impacted by the change, but you adapt, but you still continue on in the same direction. The idea of anti-fragile is not that you survive stressors, but that you actually become stronger with stressors so that you actually thrive in disorder. And the examples Nassim Taleb uses are things like our immune system, whereby our immune system gets stronger when we are, made, when things like bacteria and viruses affect our immune system. So when they affect our immune system, it typically reacts by getting stronger. And if you keep people away from any bacteria, then they become weaker when they then get into a scenario where it hits them. Or our muscles are another great example. Not my muscles, because I haven't been to exercising in a long while now. But the point being that muscles in general do better when you exercise them, and they get stronger the more stress you put on them. And that is another example of an anti-fragile kind of system. And you can start seeing that in terms of how organizations are reacting to the COVID-19 pandemic scenario. There are some organizations who are actually exapting and adapting and actually are looking for opportunities in this scenario to either build competencies within their teams or to explore new markets or to take the time to create a stronger core company than they might have had before. But some people are doing really badly because they are not ready for the uncertainty and the disorder that this pandemic has brought. And so the idea of becoming more anti-fragile is one that I think every organization will be looking at in the future. I have a slight side passion for post-apocalyptic fiction. And I remember hearing one anti-fragile consultant talk about the idea of, what if a great big green dinosaur, comes and decides to knock out your city? How will your company survive? And I'm kind of thinking maybe everyone should be thinking about these apocalyptic scenarios just to see how your company might survive. That was Barry O'Reilly in Black Tulip. He does anti-fragile architecture. But the idea being that everyone needs to start thinking about how to be more adaptive. And I think the scenario we now find ourselves in has made that more likely. Some tips around that, or maybe things to think about, would be, first of all, typically you're more anti-fragile if you have simple rules. If you have a whole load of complex processes and rules in your organization, it's very hard for people to figure out how to change them. If you put simple rules in place, that helps. Looking for redundancy and points of failure can also help. It's important not to suppress randomness, because sometimes random occurrences are actually where your biggest insights and innovation can lie. So thinking about the outliers and looking at those scenarios can often bring insights that you wouldn't get in any other way. So you can't constrain a system too tightly, or you will not see the value in innovation that could bring. Bringing up the theme of experimentation again, experimenting and tinker, that you get lots of small risks can bring you close to that. I heard someone once say that you need to do, that people need to be less thinker and more tinker, which I think is particularly hard to say if you're from Ireland, but nonetheless is a good tip. It's good when you write it down. Don't get consumed by data. So sometimes we can have a need, and particularly many of us who have been working in complicated domains and we have expertise in a particular area, we just want more analysis of data so that we can come to a conclusion, because all our years of experience has brought us to need to come to an answer. But if you get consumed by data, you'll get into analysis paralysis and you won't move forward. So we can't be consumed by data, though it's important to keep it in mind. Keeping options open is a good tip. Focus on avoiding what doesn't work, more so than looking for the one true answer of what does work, can actually bring people closer to the goal of being anti-fragile. And it is important to respect the truths, the old truths, the things that we know work. So we can't lose that. If you're going to innovate and you start messing with the systems that very much do work, that can be a danger area. So respecting the old that does work is an important principle in becoming anti-fragile. And then it comes to what I probably think is the most important competency when you're thinking about innovation, and that is really great collaboration. We've been talking about it for so long, everyone's trying to do it, but it needs continuous effort, and we can only get better at it. It's a difficult one to crack, right? I was quite amused recently when I started seeing this idea of the rise of comb people. I don't know if anyone's seen this, but a while ago, I remember having a lot of people talk to me about the idea that we need more T-shaped people. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, the idea is that if you're an I-shaped person, you have a very narrow area of expertise or speciality. And what we needed were less I-shaped people and more T-shaped people, because they should have both an area of speciality, but also a broad set of skills that make them able to interact with other people and understand other people's context, and basically have a set of broad skills that would be transferable across various different disciplines. And then that moved to the idea of a pie-shaped person, because maybe you can't have just one speciality, because you kind of need two, because that one might become, no longer necessary or relevant, so people have to spread their bets. And this becomes important when you start thinking or advising people about career paths. You kind of say, don't limit yourself to just one speciality, maybe have two. Maybe cross-disciplinary, that might work. Then I started hearing about these comb-shaped people. And I don't know about you. I think it would be marvelous having comb-shaped people where you have multiple areas of speciality and expertise and broad general knowledge. It would be wonderful if they exist, but I don't know how many of them do. Now, it is true to say that as the trends in employment move forward, that people are more often moving jobs, so they are picking up different specialities. So perhaps over time, people are developing more areas of speciality. But I'd also suggest that perhaps specialities are going out of date quicker as well. So it's hard to tell just how long these combs can get. For me, I think it's less about the idea of raising or breeding a whole lot of comb-shaped people, and more about exploring how we can bring together different people into these marvelous teams. Because, I mean, I love Alphabeti. I think that the most innovative teams are going to be diverse sets of people who are all different letter shapes coming together and really thinking about how they work really, really well together. So it's less focus on making perfect individuals and more focus on how individuals work together to bring together different disciplines and specialities. And a key passion area of mine is how do we get more cross-disciplinary efforts in innovation from the technology world with various different disciplines in order to get the best kind of innovation possible. So I think that this idea of working on better collaboration can be even more powerful than the idea of building broad sets of skills within an individual. And one of the papers that I saw that kind of echoed some of these thoughts and that I particularly liked was the idea of liquid workforce attributes. This came from Accenture. And it was talking about the idea of an ability to learn and adapt and exact being as important as deep expertise, that it's no longer enough to have deep expertise. While we respect the old, while we know that deep expertise can be very useful in certain complicated scenarios where we know the situation, we should also make sure that everyone we work with has an ability to learn and to understand that their deep expertise may not always apply, and that we have to understand that perhaps we're working in more complex domains these days. Collaboration should look at having flexible, diverse, and inclusive working environments. Again, efforts in these areas, certainly in the IT space, there's loads of efforts in diversity and inclusion, but are we actually making progress in this space? And I don't just mean gender diversity, but just thinking about, again, different ways to bring in diversity. Like, for example, bringing together teams with different disciplines, which actually could, in fact, increase things like gender diversity as well. The idea of agile project-based teaming, rather than forming teams that fix themselves because of their organizational structure, but rather having teams that actually can move and come together as needed with speciality areas, and how do we actually orchestrate that is a very interesting problem. And this idea of great communication has been there forever, and it's so important to have high trust and low fear and an ability to fail without losing all your credibility, professional credibility. These are emotional supports to having a liquid workforce, an experimental workforce, and a workforce that innovates really well. The idea of integrating automated agents. So with AI and machine learning, there are loads of tools that can augment people's roles, but we have to figure out how to do that in a good way. I actually was aware before Christmas, I heard about an organization who were running diversity and inclusion training, and they were including automated agents as one of the inclusive parties in a diverse team, which I thought was very, very interesting, and maybe we'll see more of that. But there's definitely a trend towards having more gig workers, contractors. The idea that we should be exploring collaboration, not just within a team, but beyond the boundaries of our team, but also beyond the boundaries of our organization, or in fact beyond the boundaries of our nation. And we see the necessity for that, even in terms of how we as people are coming together to address the challenges that COVID-19 situation brings. So the idea of open innovation has become a lot more important as the world understands that there's just so much potential and so many challenges that no one organization or one team could or should be able to do it all themselves. So collaboration across borders becomes so much more important. And this idea of being able to effectively adopt technology and appropriate uses of data and analytics. These are all incredibly important attributes for flexible working teams that can innovate. So to wrap up, I suppose these are just a sample of some of the areas that I have found incredibly illuminating and interesting when you start looking at how to create more innovation within organizations. Sometimes a focus on just technology can make you forget that there are other far more important things in my mind, which is this idea of dealing with complexity by helping people understand how to do safe to fail experimentation. How does that work within your organization? By looking at competencies like effective decision making, and in fact collaboration, and then thinking about how do you make diverse, open and evolving collaboration a priority within your business. So for me, these are some of the areas that I think if organizations are to really innovate well, they really need to take a good look at. And I'll leave you with another quote by Lauren Bacall, who has an amazing array of quotes, it should be known. And I love this one, which is that I am not a has-been, I am a will-be, because we all have been something, and it all influences us, where our background is and how we've worked in the past. But none of it defines us, because we are all what we will be in the future. And we all have an opportunity to be something different and to innovate. And for me, that's what innovation is. It's about what we will be and what we choose to be in the future, and the path we take there, and the learning journeys we go on as we are on that journey. Thank you very much. That's it for me. I think I will pop into the Q&A button now to see what might be there. And let me see, can I give an anecdotal example of an experiment used to probe complex situations? I can. So I think I'll use one from my own experience. There was a time, a long time ago, when I was working in Microsoft, and we, at the time, some of you may remember Microsoft's own experimentations in the phone market. And at the time, our team was involved in working with phone developers to get apps for the Microsoft phone platform. And our team had been used to working with a lot of .NET developers, folks that would be, we had a lot of competencies in that space. We had built up communities. We had been working for many years in terms of doing evangelism into that space. And once we were given this new challenge of trying to get phone apps into the store, none of our playbooks worked anymore. And trying to get them to build phone apps was not a good idea, nor were their motivations the same. So it turned out that the folks building phone apps were much more financially motivated, and they had business models around it, which often developers we had been working with weren't necessarily as concerned with. So we threw out the playbook, and I remember at the time that we actually said, well, what are we going to do now? Because we're not doing any of that anymore. And I remember I really remember at the time we were all in the meeting room, and we started putting up ideas and said, right, well, we're just going to have to do this from scratch. What are we going to do? And we had a board where we had about 18 different ideas, and we were just like, well, we don't know what's going to work. Let's give it a go. Let's give it a whirl. And we started doing that, and we started reporting back as a team on a weekly basis to say, are there reasons why do we think this is working? And where it did, we started investing more money in those areas. And so we got into this cycle of actually learning very quickly and changing what we were working on based on what those experiments were, like what audiences we would actually engage with, what we would say to them, what messaging worked or didn't work, and whether or not, or what we could do to actually accelerate their efforts in terms of bringing phone apps to the store. So that was my example of experimentation, and to be honest, I suppose it was easy to fail in that scenario because everything wasn't working before anyway. So anything new was going to be better scenario. So that worked well for us. The rise of the combs and collaborators. Yeah, the rise of the combs is an interesting one, all right. But I do think that the new generation are perhaps less likely, because they are changing roles so frequently, they are probably more likely to have more areas of expertise, or at least more experiences. And so it is important to be able to think about how both combs and T-shaped people and I-shaped people and pie-shaped people and all the other letters in the alphabet can all work together very, very well. Can I give more practical examples to make diverse cultural teams more collaborative? That's an interesting one. I've been playing around with that a little bit lately myself. And I did a workshop recently where we had folks from various different cultural backgrounds. And we started actually by helping people share a little bit of more personal details, things that they liked, they didn't like, kind of like a user manual for themselves, kind of like how I learn, what I don't like, how I don't like to learn, how I like to get feedback, how I like to give feedback, what really annoys me or what really gets me excited. And people started sharing that with each other. And actually it caused an amazing amount of marvelous kind of connections between these people who had barely known each other beforehand. And it kind of accelerated this idea of building trust, I think. So that's maybe one example of something that people can try. I'm happy to share that user manual template we used. So if you're interested in that, you can let me know. Here's one here. Why is attrition looked like in a negative view? It's healthy to an extent, brings in fresh blood, ideas, and keeps people re-energized, and it does. And I think you have it's like it's a continuum. These things are always good in balance, right? So if you have too much attrition and people are constantly leaving and no one's in your organization for more than 6 months, you have a problem, right? Because you're always onboarding and there's no consistency and you can't actually have a kind of a collective knowledge that you're building. So, there's too far in that extreme, and then there's too far in this extreme, which is that if you have the same team, which never changes, you're not bringing in new ideas, you're not bringing new experiences, that too is bad. So the answer, where it's optimal, somewhere in the middle. What's manageable for your organization may not be for others, depending on the onboarding curve that you have to go through. So I think that's particularly an area for experimentation. What is the right level of attrition that is optimal for your organization? Am I aware of a course, department, or university that covers these topics? I am not aware of a course, department, or university that covers all these topics. But if someone else is, please let me know. I certainly know from my own perspective that a lot of these things are a constantly evolving field. The Cynefin framework and Dave Snowden's work with Cognitive Edge, they have a training course online that I'm currently going through. But I think a lot of these areas, I'm not sure of one course that covers them all. I find them, there's a lot of them that are quite new. Though some people have been telling me more about that their decision-making architectures might be coming up in some courses. So I might look into that one. If anyone else has any ideas, let me know. Stephen Boyle in UCD Smurfit's school covers decision-making. There we go. So there's someone covering a bit of that. Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gives you some food for thought. And thank you so much for the interaction and the questions. I'm looking forward to going through them all later and even to get some ideas for my next set of learnings. And I hope that wherever you are, lockdown is treating you well. And hopefully we'll see you at another learning session sometime in the future. So thank you again to ICT Skillnet, and thank you to all the attendees. It's been a pleasure to be here today. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this webinar, please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to be kept up to date with all our news, events and programs. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this one.